Welcome to the next episode of Black Man Spy, where we're going to continue my mission Middle East. As you can see, I'm back in the United States after an extended period of time in the Middle East, particularly spent quite a bit of time in Israel so that we would get both sides of the perspective of what's happening there. As you know, I come at this problem from a counterterrorism perspective. I've worked the Israel-Palestine crisis for decades. Actually, the first operations I did were against Palestinian terrorist groups in Lebanon in 1983. I speak the local dialects, and I have almost 40 years of experience looking at this subject. I know it's new for many of you, so I'm going to try to give you a hard reality, intelligence-based perspective on what the history of this is without any bias. Some people are coming at this with a hard bias from one side or the other side. History does not care about your bias. It is what it is. The events occurred as they occurred. So with that, I'm going to continue the history of the Palestinian-Israel crisis leading up to the 10/7 massacre in 2023. But Malcolm, this thing goes back, at least 75 years. Wrong. This goes back thousands and thousands of years. Israel, the kingdom of Israel, has been around for at least 3,000 years, like we showed you archaeologically in the previous episode. They have been there consistently with three factors: living on that land for almost 3,200-ish years, if you don't include the 12 Canaanite tribes. They have been speaking the same language, Hebrew, for 3,000 years. And they have been practicing the exact same religion for 3,000 or more years. So you cannot say that this is a problem that started 75 years ago, that the Jews have not been on that terrain. That is just historical, archaeological fact. You can go to museums all over the world and see the history of Judaism on this land. But Malcolm, wasn't this actually Abraham, that nomadic father of a very large tribe that came from the city of Al-Nasiriyah, what is currently in Iraq, at that time called Ur, and then he became an itinerant, laboring family that went around the Middle East and got work in Egypt, and then crossed over with Moses and escaped, and then saw what would become Judea and Samaria? Yes, that is what the Bible says. That is what the oral history of the nomadic tribes of Israel at Judea was. But everyone was nomadic back then. I have people say, well, the Jews aren't indigenous to Palestine. Well, in fact, they were. As a matter of fact, they were also indigenous in the year 610 in a small village called Mecca on the southern Arabian Gulf, and where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, first was introduced to the Jewish and Christian faiths while he carried out caravans going back and forth along the Western Arabian Peninsula as far north as Jerusalem. This is not something that anyone who's studied it can come into and say is a recent phenomenon. So now we left off with the end of World War I, where T.E. Lawrence had carried out the successful attack using the Arab tribes of the Hijaz, that's Western Saudi Arabia, bringing these nomadic and village-based tribes together, Islamic tribes, and attacking the Ottoman Empire in Aqaba, and then pushing them out and taking Jerusalem. This became the start of what would be known at the end of World War I as the British Mandate. The British Mandate was a terrain, or was actually land, that was ceded to the control of the British after World War I. What would become modern Lebanon and Syria were given over to the French, and what is now modern Jordan and Israel-Palestine, if you want to use that term, became the British Mandate. The British gave one half of that, or put under the control of one half of that, to a group called the Hashemites, a tribe from the east side of the Jordan River. But it was all controlled at that time by the king of Saudi Arabia, who they installed as the supreme leader of the Arabs, because he went with them and fought the Ottoman Empire with T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and this was his reward. But the British Mandate was a British occupation of this terrain, of all this land. In 1917, a letter was written by Lord Rothschild, a British member of parliament, to Lord Balfour. I would just want to get his title right. And the letter was supposedly a discussion about the legitimacy of Jews who live in Palestine, because Jews have always, since centuries, millennia, lived in that space, and the Jews of Theodore Herzl and others returned to Israel movement that wanted to return back to their ancestral Jewish homeland. The letter was known as the Balfour Declaration, which was the first time that Jews who were not living in Israel at that time received recognition that they had a right to return to their homeland and exist as a state. Now, this created an enormous amount of trouble with the local Arab tribes and Arab natives who lived in what was now known as Palestine, the British Palestine. In fact, every citizen, Jewish and Muslim, were known as British Palestinians. Everyone had a passport that said British Palestine on it. That's because the British took an old Roman Latin name, Palestina, which we talked about in the first episode, and used that because they all studied the classics. And in the classics, the Romans had designated this area as Palestina, and they kept it out of nostalgia or classicism. So they referred to this area as Palestine and the people in it as Palestinians, with no distinction as to religion. If you were in the British Mandate, you were a British Mandate Palestinian, Jew and Muslim. However, the Arabs did not take well to the arrival of Jews and the presence of Jews who had lived there at all. In the 1930s, particularly in 1936, the Great Arab Revolt started. Many of these Arabs were not extant or not indigenous to Palestine itself either. Many were immigrant workers who came from Egypt, who came from Syria, and who came from Saudi Arabia and the Hijaz. And their families' names reflect that. So the Great Arab Revolt attacked the British Mandate in Yaffo and other parts of Israel, and the British put it down ruthlessly. But the core of the attacks were against Jews. The Peel Commission would be the document that came from the study in 1937 that would indicate that there needed to be a two-state solution between the Jews and the Muslim Arabs who lived in the British Mandate of Palestine. Now, that doesn't mean that the Muslims were the bad guys in this story altogether, because during this period of time, there were Jewish radicals who created a terrorist group, first a self-defense group called the Haganah, and then a terrorist group called the Irgun. Another terrorist group, even more extreme, was known as the Stern Gang. And they actually blew up the British headquarters in the British Mandate of Palestine in Jerusalem, the King David Hotel, as a way of expressing their displeasure with British rule inside the Mandate. This, and of course, the recommendations of the Peel Commission, the formulation of the United Nations, the first major problem that they would try to solve was creating a two-state solution in 1947, which would create a Jewish state and an Arab state, Arab Muslim state, and Christians, splitting the area that is what now modern-day Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. The Israelis accepted this plan and declared independence in 1948. The Arabs, on the other hand, refused this plan, refused to accept a two-state solution, refused to accept an Arab state. They wanted the entire geographic area from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River as their Arab Muslim only homeland. And that started the 1948 war. The nations of Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria combined an army force and tried to invade what is modern-day Israel with their armies. In doing so, they asked the 700,000 Arabs who lived there to leave, go to refugee camps in Lebanon, what is now Gaza, outside in what is in Jordan, and that they would slaughter all the Jews and give them back, give the entire land back to the surviving Muslims. So the Arab left and they became refugees. Now, the 1948 war didn't go well for the Arab forces. The Israelis, using military surplus from Europe, better tactics, and being able to defend against these armies who had a lot of weapons but weren't particularly well trained, defeated all of the combined Arab forces and solidified the land of Israel as it existed up until 1967. Why 1967, Malcolm? Because they did not take the area of Jerusalem and they didn't take most of the West Bank from Jordan. They managed to defeat Jordanian forces. It was very clear that they lost. They fell back, and Israel had the first step of its homeland. In 1956, Israel did plot with Britain and France to help seize the Suez Canal back from Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, who had nationalized the canal and wanted to keep it under Egyptian control. The British and the French convinced the Israelis to secretly invade the Sinai Peninsula, and the French and the British parachuted into Port Said and other points along the Suez Canal and seized it back. The only reason this failed is because American President Dwight Eisenhower wasn't having it. It was very clear the British and the French were just stealing the Suez Canal from the Egyptians, who were being backed by Russia, and forced the British and the French to withdraw and the Israelis to leave the Sinai Peninsula. But that wouldn't end anything. In 1967, the combined Arab armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria decided that they were going to invade Israel again. Their armies massed in the Sinai Peninsula and along the borders, but Israel, having more advanced aircraft technology, better combat commanders, and had spent years developing their tank forces and military forces, launched a surprise attack against them, destroyed all their armies and air bases in the field, dominated the skies over Egypt, Jordan, and southern Syria, and defeated all of the combined Arab forces in just 6 days. This would be known as the Six-Day War. But wait, Malcolm, did anything else happen before the Six-Day War that would affect what we're talking about today? Why, yes, in fact. In one of my previous segments, I made a mistake and said that Yasser Arafat was actually born in Syria. He's indeed born in Cairo in 1929 to a father who was a Palestinian from Gaza and a mother who is Egyptian. His entire family, for the most part, was from Egypt on his maternal side. Then they moved to Kuwait City, and that's where he was raised. But he became the leader of the Palestinian cause in 1964. Yasser Arafat created a group he called the Palestinian Liberation Organization. The PLO was supposed to be a terrorist group modeled on the 1940s Israeli Stern Gang that blew up the King David Hotel and would carry out acts of terrorism around the world to gain attention for what he called the Palestinian people. This would really be the first time that the Arabs who lived inside and around Israel, who were displaced in 1948 as refugees, got an identity as Philistini, as they say in Arabic, Palestinians. And that is where the modern reference to Palestinian Arabs and Christians came from Yasser Arafat. Arafat was backed by the Arab League. He was backed by Russia and the KGB, and they started carrying out acts of terrorism all across the Middle East. Most noteworthy was in Jordan in 1967 when they skyjacked 4, I believe, airliners, brought them all out to a field, which at that time was called Dawson's Field, invited in all the news media, and then blew up millions of dollars of aircraft for the news media. And this started the sensationalism of international terrorism that we know so well today. By 1970, the PLO was getting money, funding, and resources from all around the world, particularly the Soviet Union, and they were carrying out acts of terrorism. They were training in these refugee camps and organized into many different factions, including almost the Monty Python-esque Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Palestine Liberation Authority. Al-Fatah was the terrorist branch of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. There were many, many different Marxist, socialist, communist, nationalist terrorist groups. Now, you notice I did not say Islamist, because at that time, these groups were mainly hardcore socialist, communist-backed groups with lots of funding from the communist Soviet Union at that time. One of the greatest strokes that they carried out, which would solidify the resolve of Israel, was the 1972 kidnapping and massacre of Israeli Olympians in Munich, Germany, during the 1972 Olympics. The PLO took over the dormitories of the Israeli athletes, killed a few, and then with a very public spectacle of parading weapons and equipment around, explosives, they captured the world's imagination and popularized the Palestinian cause by threatening to execute the Israelis. They were going to be given a flight out of the country, which was becoming very popular, skyjacking, when the German government intervened at Munich airport, and very bad sharpshooters did not kill the terrorists. The terrorists blew the Israeli hostages up by throwing hand grenades into the helicopters that they were on board, killing almost all of the hostages. All of the hostages, in fact. The 1972 Olympics would mark a watershed, a big turn in the way the world saw the Palestinians. They were not a beleaguered foe. They were considered now a threat to Western order as international terrorists. In 1973, Egypt, on the other hand, they had their own surprises. On 6 October 1973, Egypt invaded Israel with the intent to get the Sinai Peninsula that had been taken in 1967 in the 66-day war back from Israel. And they succeeded in doing that. The Israelis defeated the Syrian forces, but the Egyptians and Israel fought to a negotiated truce when Israel counterattacked the Egyptian forces using Ariel Sharon, one of their more brilliant generals, to take a daring raid across the Suez Canal to cut off the Egyptians' Third Army and open up the roads towards Cairo. And that's when a negotiated peace between Israel and Egypt was on the table. It took 6 more years, and in 1979, the entire Sinai Peninsula was returned to Egypt, and a peace treaty between Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, and at that time, Menachem Begin, the terrorist leader of the Stern Gang in the 1940s, who became the great peacemaker, earned them both the Nobel Prize, and peace was restored between the great powers in the Middle East. That did not solve any of the terrorism problems. The terror wars would start soon after this, because Egypt, in returning having the Sinai Peninsula given to them, one of the things they did not want back was they did not want the Gaza Strip. They didn't want the million or so people at that time who were in it. They didn't want the mandate for it. But there were two factors at play. One, the Egyptian government didn't need another million people. Two, by removing the Palestinians from Gaza, you would technically eliminate the Palestinians as an entity, and they would be forced to become Egyptians. So this was the thinking of most Arab leaders. Leave the problem in Israel's lap, and then there will have to be a forced two-state solution at some point in the future. Sort of wise, but it was an abandonment of the Arab states. Jordan abandoned the West Bank to Israel, did not want the Palestinians who were there, and the Egyptians abandoned the Gaza Strip. And that's how we got the two entities that exist today. But Israel had many other issues, and those issues would come to fruition in 1987, when what we would call the First Intifada, which was led by the father of the Intifada, Margaz Barghouti, who was a Palestinian Authority officer. A Palestinian Authority would be the negotiated name of when the PLO took over administration of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The Intifada was a street-level uprising using rocks, stones, and terrorism to pressure the Israeli government to give them autonomy. This led to the 1993 Oslo Peace Accords, which essentially put them on track to a two-state solution, where the West Bank and Gaza would be administered by the PLO's Palestinian Authority, and then Israel would maintain security guarantees, or would have security guarantees, that there would be no terrorism on the nation state of Israel. And that's awesome. But in the year 2000, the situation deteriorated into what would be called the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada would lead to the withdrawal of Israel from Gaza in 2005 in its entirety, including moving out all settlers, moving out their dead from cemeteries, even though Gaza, historically and archaeologically, was a millennia-old Jewish area. But Israel withdrew in an effort to meet the peace accords and end the Second Intifada. The Oslo Accords were met with such acrimony in Israel that in 1995, Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister who negotiated them, was assassinated by an Israeli citizen for cutting a deal with the Arabs. In 2005, the terrorist group Hamas would win the election that was given as a referendum on who should control Gaza. The Palestinian Authority officers who were in there at the time in 2007 were all gathered up by Hamas and summarily executed. And this solidified Hamas's control over the Gaza Strip. Now, Malcolm, what is Hamas? Hamas is an Islamic fundamentalist terrorist group. It's actually an acronym for Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islami, the Islamic resistance movement. Their philosophy is based on one religious belief: that Israel and all Jews must be slaughtered, and that the land must be returned and Jerusalem come under the control of Islamic fundamentalists. Interestingly enough, Hamas is a Sunni Muslim group, which means they come from the overwhelming majority of Muslims in the world, the Sunni, which is 85% of all Muslims in the world. But their principal support came from the Iranian Shia, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And so over the years, they started smuggling in weapons, equipment, and explosives from Egypt. And in 2014, would have a war with Israel almost on par of the size of the war that we had today. That war, though, only went 50 days. But during that 50 days, Hamas had launched suicide bomber attacks inside of Israel, had carried out gun attacks, knifings, and murders all across the Strip and the border with Israel. At that time, there was no fence between Israel and the Gaza Strip. But after multiple suicide bombings killed and wounded hundreds of Israelis, Israel put in an armed fence around the Gaza Strip. Believe it or not, that fence, it was nowhere near the size, proportion, and depth of the 7 fences that Egypt built in between the Gaza Strip and its Sinai Peninsula, which is known as the Philadelphia Corridor. But Israel built a fence that was supposed to give them the ability to detect any attacks coming out of there and to check workers who were working, the 50,000 workers in Israel, if they were carrying weapons or explosives. From 2014, Hamas was supposed to be rebuilding the Gaza Strip. They were getting billions upon billions of dollars from the United Nations Refugee and Works Agency, UNRWA, which had been established to support the refugees from 1948. And they were getting billions upon billions of dollars from the Gulf states like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, in order to develop the Strip into a habitable home for the near 2 million people that they would have by the time 2020 came. Even the United States and Israel gave them money, believing that if they developed their land better, they would not resort to terrorism. But unbeknownst to almost everyone, Hamas took that money and spent years developing hundreds of kilometers of underground tunnels, hoarding weapons, equipment, smuggling in explosives from Iran, and then preparing for a full-scale invasion of Israel. That invasion would come on 7 October 2023, when over 2,000 Palestinian terrorists attacked the fence lines and breached it in 22 places. But as a military force, did they flow through that fence, go out and set up positions and wait for the Israeli army to come so they could fight them mano a mano against the Israeli army? No, they did not. What the strategy was to cross the fence line, go into the nearest kibbutzim, Kfar Aza, Be'eri, Nahal Oz, the city of Siderat, the city of Ashkelon, to penetrate as far as possible into Israel and slaughter every man, woman, and child that they encountered. Their mission was genocidal. They were to kill every Jew. That is what the Palestinian Hamas forces did on 7 October. What they didn't seem to understand was, even though they had gone 10 to 15 kilometers in every direction into Israel, was that the Israelis, when really pushed, could muster up 100,000 men with the most advanced weaponry in the world and come back and kill every man that invaded Israel. But there were more than just Hamas coming into Israel. There was the first wave were the Hamas terrorists. The second wave were average Palestinians who went in to loot, kill, and take revenge against Israelis that they actually worked for. And then the third wave came in to take what the second wave didn't loot, and they took everything back. So when the Israeli army, police, and average soldier and defense forces, because every village had a defense force, counterattacked, they essentially killed the first wave off. But the second wave of civilians and third wave of civilians went back across the fence with the surviving Hamas members, who took 250 Israeli citizens hostage to use as bargaining chips. And that is what led us to 7 October. It was a terrorist invasion of Israel. It was vengeance, nothing more, nothing less, to fulfill their religious messianic plan of taking back Jerusalem. But they couldn't do it because they didn't have the military power. They invaded in pickup trucks and motor scooters. Yes, they did successfully bloody Israel's nose due to a prime minister that was not fulfilling his primary duty in defending the land of Israel against terrorists. So, Malcolm, the Palestinian Hamas Nukba forces, their elite assault forces, they only killed Jews, right? No. Remember how I said they invaded Israel and they killed every man, woman, and child they encountered? Hamas terrorists did not just kill every Jew, although that's exactly what they did when they found them for the most part, except for the 250 hostages they took back. They killed every person. They killed black 10 students from Tanzania, took them hostage, and then on video knifed them to death. They took Ethiopian Jews as well as Ethiopian Christians. They took Filipino Christians. They took Hindus, aid workers who were there who were helping the elderly in these kibbutzes. They killed them or took them hostage. They wiped out a 70-person Bedouin tribe of Bedouin Muslims who had been living on that land for centuries. And as one of them said, "You stayed here, you're no better than the Jews." They wiped out Chaldean Christians. They wiped out Israeli Arab Christians. They wiped out Israeli Arab Muslims. They wiped out people from 50 different countries who weren't even Jews, including the famous German woman who was there at a dance festival. This was a slaughter of every person on the other side of that fence. And this is what is going to lead us into our next episode, where I go into the details, the horrible, disgusting details of what happened on October 7th and how that led to the bloody Israel-Hamas war.